Welcome to Heartbreaker, your love radio.
On a quiet autumn afternoon, with leaves already painting the sidewalks in shades of orange and red, George paced back and forth in the living room, considering the decision he and Diana had made. It was a practical decision, born out of economic necessity and a space in their large house that was rarely used. Do you really think this is a good idea, George? Diana asked, still somewhat hesitant about the idea of renting out the spare room. She stirred her teacup, looking at George with a mild expression of concern. George stopped, looking at his wife with a reassuring gaze. Yes, I do. We're not using the room, and the extra money will help us with the bills and maybe even allow us to take the trip we've always planned. Diana nodded slowly, her reservations diminishing as she considered the practical benefits. Okay, but how are we going to choose the right person to live here? What if we don't get along? We'll make a careful selection. We'll make sure it's someone trustworthy and who shares some of our values, George replied, trying to dispel her concerns. And so, after careful selection and several interviews, they decided to rent the room to Emily, a young working professional and postgraduate student who was looking for a quiet place to stay while completing her studies. Emily seemed friendly and respectful, and her references were impeccable. On the day Emily was to move in, George prepared the room to ensure she felt welcome. He painted the walls a soft blue, set up a small bookshelf with books he knew were on her interests list, and even placed a small vase of flowers on the windowsill. I hope you like the room, Emily, George said, showing her the space. We want you to feel at home here. Emily looked around, clearly touched by the attention to detail. It's perfect, George. Thank you so much for doing all this. I'm really happy to be here. Great. If you need anything or have any questions, don't hesitate to ask us, George replied, feeling confident they had made the right choice. At that moment, Diana entered the room with a welcome tray containing tea and cookies, smiling at Emily. Welcome to our home, Emily. We hope you'll enjoy staying here as much as we enjoy being here. With a symbolic toast of tea cups, they celebrated the new arrangement. George felt satisfied, unaware that the simple decision to rent out a room would bring consequences they could never have foreseen. At that moment, however, everything seemed to be falling perfectly into place, and the house felt more alive with the new presence. The sun was still rising, casting a golden glow over the city when Charles arrived at the workshop. With the key still dangling in the ignition, he could already hear the familiar sound of tools and muffled conversations echoing through the grease-stained walls. Today, like many other days, he began with a simple task, inspecting a Nissan Caravan that needed approval for license renewal. Charles, good you're here early. We need this Nissan ready before noon. The customer is a good friend of the shop, Mr. Donovan, his boss, said as he handed him the clipboard with the service details. No problem, Mr. Donovan. I'll start on it right away, Charles replied, already heading towards the vehicle. After a meticulous hour of checking and some minor adjustments, Charles noted the final observations on the clipboard. Everything seemed in order, except for a warning light that stubbornly refused to turn off. He decided that a visit to the licensing department was necessary to ensure everything would be in compliance. I'll have to stop by the licensing department. It seems like the warning light might be a system issue they need to check, Charles informed Mr. Donovan. He understood, but the downtown department is closed today for training. You'll have to go to the one near your house, Mr. Donovan replied, checking his wristwatch. Charles nodded and grabbed his keys. The sudden change of plans didn't bother him. In fact, it gave him a chance to swing by home quickly to grab his computer. He knew the rest of the day would be long, and he wanted to prepare. Arriving at the licensing department near his house, Charles discovered that, against all expectations, this one was closed too. A small notice on the door read, "Closed for internal training until 2 p.m. Frustrated, he pulled out his cell phone. You won't believe it, Mr. Donovan, but this one is closed too. I'll have to wait until the afternoon, Charles spoke into the phone, his tone mixing irritation with resignation. Well, that's a surprise. All right, Charles, take the opportunity to do what you need around there and come back when you can, Mr. Donovan said with experienced calm. Hanging up the phone, Charles decided he would use the trip to head home, not far from there. The clock had barely passed 10 in the morning when Charles turned onto his street, a quiet tree-lined avenue in a peaceful suburb. The tranquility of the place contrasted with the frustration still pulsating in his mind due to the setback with the licensing department. He parked his car in the garage and noticed a second car there, recognizable yet unexpected. It was Emily's vehicle, the tenant his father, George, had brought to live with them a few months ago. Charles thought she should be at work at that hour, which piqued his curiosity. Before he could formulate a theory, a sound broke the stillness of the environment. It was muffled moans coming from the direction of the house. His first instinct was concern. Perhaps someone was injured. He quickened his pace towards the front door, opening it silently. Hello. His voice echoed through the empty corridors, but there was no response. The sound seemed to be coming from upstairs, more specifically from Emily's room. Driven by a mixture of concern and confusion, Charles climbed the stairs, trying to pinpoint the exact origin of the noises. Upon reaching the second-floor hallway, he stopped, trying to listen more closely. The sound was definitely moans, and now they were clear and unmistakable. He walked up to the slightly ajar door of Emily's room and, hesitantly, knocked lightly. Emily? Is everything okay in there? Charles asked, his voice firm despite the nervousness beginning to take hold. There was no response, just the abrupt cessation of the noises. Silence. Then, soft footsteps approached the door, and it opened partially. Emily appeared, visibly surprised and somewhat disheveled, her face flushed. Charles. I didn't expect you right now, she stammered, clearly uncomfortable. I just came to get my computer. I thought you would be at work. Are you all right? Charles tried to keep the conversation neutral, but his mind was racing trying to piece things together.
Yeah, I'm fine.
I was just doing some exercises. Yoga, Emily replied quickly, a bit too quickly. Sorry for the noises. All right. Charles wasn't entirely convinced but decided not to press. Well, I'll get my computer and be on my way. Didn't mean to disturb. He turned to head to his room, but a detail in the environment still bothered him. There was something unsaid in the air, something Emily wasn't sharing. Charles knew something was off, but decided to let it go, for now. He grabbed his computer and left the room, but the seed of doubt was already planted. Why was his father's car also in the garage, if he should be at work at that time of day? After retrieving his computer, Charles still felt restless. The presence of the two cars in the garage and Emily's strange behavior wouldn't leave his mind. Determined to clarify his doubts, he descended the stairs slowly, thoughts swirling in his mind. As he approached the kitchen, he noticed something even stranger. His father's car keys, headphones, and phone were on the counter. Her father always took these items with him, especially because he liked to run during his breaks from work. Charles's pulse quickened, curiosity giving way to growing anxiety. He walked back upstairs, directly to Emily's room. Before he reached the door, he heard the shower turn on in the bathroom next door. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on Emily's bedroom door again. Emily, I need to talk to you. It's important, he called, trying to remain calm. With no response, he turned the handle and opened the door. The room seemed empty at first glance, but something about the room seemed off. Then he saw it. His father, George, was hiding behind the door, wearing nothing but boxers. Shock and confusion overcame Charles instantly. Dad. What are you doing here? Charles exclaimed, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. George, visibly embarrassed, tried to compose himself. Charles, this isn't what it seems. I can explain, he began, clearly struggling to find the right words. Explain? Explain what, Dad? Why are you hiding here with practically no clothes on? The frustration and disappointment in Charles's voice was palpable. I just came here to, George stammered, unable to form a convincing excuse. Charles looked at his father, the man who had always been his model of integrity and honor. Seeing him in that situation, vulnerable and evasive, broke her heart. I don't know what to say, Dad. I really don't know, Charles murmured, the pain evident in his words. He took a step back, the need for physical distance as strong as his emotional one. George made a move as if to reach Charles, but stopped, knowing that any gesture now would be misinterpreted or rejected. Charles, please give me a chance to explain this better. It's not what you think. But Charles had already retreated, the trust too broken for any immediate conversation to resolve. He left the room quickly, the image of his father in that situation burned into his mind, a painful memory he knew he wouldn't soon forget. The silence that followed each spoken word in the room was heavy, laden with the weight of the revealed betrayal. Charles, with clenched fists at his sides, faced George, whose defeated posture only fueled his son's anger. How could you do this to our family, Dad? How? Charles almost shouted, pain overflowing in every syllable. George, struggling with his own emotions, tried to formulate a response that could somehow mitigate the situation. I know I messed up, Charles. I would give anything to change what happened, but nothing, Dad. There's no excuse that can justify what you did, Charles interrupted, his voice trembling with anger. Did you think about us? About me, about Mom, when you decided to betray her like this? George shook his head, his eyes welling up. No, I didn't think. It was selfish, it was terrible. I hate myself for it. You should, Charles spat out the words with disdain. You not only broke Mom's trust, you destroyed the foundation of our family. You chose this. You chose to betray us. There was a moment of heavy silence, and then George tried to approach, reaching out towards his son. Charles, please, don't touch me. Charles recoiled abruptly, hitting the table behind him. You have no right. Not after what you've done. George withdrew his hand, and for a moment, his expression reflected the total helplessness he felt. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you more than anything. Please, believe me. I believe you. Charles laughed bitterly. All my life, I looked up to you. You were my hero, my role model. And now? You're just a liar, a traitor. Charles's words were like blows, each one more painful than the last. George remained motionless, knowing that any defense would be futile in the face of the undeniable truth. You're dead to me, Charles said finally, each word carrying finality. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at you the same way again. Without waiting for a response, Charles turned his back on his father and left the room, leaving George alone with the echo of his words. The door closed with a final click, symbolizing the irreparable rupture between father and son. As Charles walked out of the house, the reality of his words began to sink in. He knew that nothing would ever be the same, and the journey ahead would be one of the hardest of his life. Charles drove aimlessly through the city streets, the tumult of his thoughts drowning out the traffic noise around him. He felt as though every certainty in his life had been ripped away, leaving him adrift in a sea of doubt and disillusionment. Finally, he stopped at a seldom visited park, a place he used to go to think or run. Sitting on one of the benches overlooking the tranquil lake, he allowed the calm of nature to envelop him, trying to process the avalanche of emotions consuming him. How could you, Dad? Charles whispered to himself, the question echoing in his mind like a painful mantra. How could you destroy everything? He thought of the many times he had defended his father, seen him as a model of integrity and strength. The betrayal had not only broken his heart, it had shattered the image Charles had of his father, leaving him with a profound sense of loss. I trusted him. He was everything I wanted to be, Charles reflected, his voice choked with emotion. Unshed tears stung his eyes as he struggled to keep his composure. The light breeze carried the fresh scent of cut grass, a reminder of the afternoons he had spent playing soccer with his father in that same park. Those memories, once sources of joy, were now tinged with sadness and betrayal. Will I ever understand why he did this? Charles asked the wind, knowing there would be no answer. He reached for his phone several times, tempted to call a friend or even his mother, but something held him back. The revelation was too personal, too raw, and he wasn't ready to share his pain. Why? Charles spoke aloud. He remained seated, watching as the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors he would normally find beautiful. Today, however, they seemed only to mark the end of a day he wished had never begun. Finally, as daylight gave way to the first stars, Charles stood up. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. With a heavy sigh, Charles left the park behind him, the solitude of his reflections a constant companion as he walked back to his car. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was determined to find some peace, some understanding, no matter how difficult the journey. Charles arrived home later that night, the atmosphere heavy and laden with an impending storm. Upon entering, he found his mother, Diana, in the kitchen, standing with the expression of someone who had been dealt a devastating blow. The silence between them was palpable, filled with unspoken emotions. Mom, I need to tell you about Dad, Charles began hesitantly, his voice trembling with inner turmoil. Diana looked at him, her eyes already red and swollen. I already know, Charles. Your father told me everything. He said you saw him with Emily. Her voice faltered at the name, pain evident in every word. Charles approached, placing a hand on his mother's shoulder, seeking to offer some comfort despite his own pain. Mom, I'm so sorry you have to go through this. I don't know what to say. Diana shrugged, a frail and sad gesture. There's nothing to say, Charles. What's done is done. But I need to understand, George, why. She raised her voice, more to herself than to anyone else. At that moment, George entered the kitchen, his face marked by remorse. Diana, I have no excuses that can justify what I did. I was a fool, and now I'm losing everything that matters to me. Diana turned to face her husband. Did you think about your actions, George? About the effects they would have on our family? On our son? George shook his head, clearly struggling with guilt. I didn't think, and that was my greatest failing. I can only ask for your forgiveness, though I know I don't deserve it. Charles watched the exchange between his parents, his heart heavy. And what do we do now? How can we move forward from here? Charles's question was for both of them, a plea for direction in the chaos that had become their family life. Diana sighed, a sound of weariness and resignation. I don't know, Charles. I really don't know. We need time to think, to decide if there's anything worth saving in our marriage. I'll do whatever it takes, anything, George insisted, but his offer sounded hollow in the empty space between his words and his past actions. Charles looked from one to the other, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. Maybe we should all take some time. Diana and George nodded silently, neither of them able to argue against the wisdom in Charles's words. As Charles climbed the stairs to his room, he knew that the coming weeks, or even months, would test his strength and his ability to forgive. The future was uncertain, and the only certainty was that the journey would be difficult. But for now, silence was a refuge, and that night, he chose to lose himself in it. After the painful confrontation with Charles and the revealing conversation with Diana, George found himself tormented by the weight of his actions. Sitting alone in the living room, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared on the horizon, he made a decision he knew was necessary, not only for his redemption, but also for the possible recovery of his marriage. Rising with a deep sigh, George went to find Diana, who was in the kitchen, trying to distract herself with small tasks. Diana, he began, hesitant but firm in his resolution, I'm going to terminate Emily's lease. She'll have to find another place to live. I'll never look at her again. Diana, surprised by the initiative, looked at George, trying to read his intentions. That's the least you should do. Yes, it's the right thing to do. I need to fix things, no matter how hard it is. And this is just the beginning, George replied, feeling a mixture of relief and pain as he verbalized his decision. Diana nodded slightly, a complex expression of relief and caution crossing her face. All right. George went upstairs to communicate the decision to Emily, each step echoing as a reminder of the consequences of his choices. Upon reaching the door of Emily's room, he knocked lightly, preparing for a difficult conversation. However, upon opening the door, George found Emily already packing her bags. She turned, surprised to see him, but her expression quickly changed to one of resignation. I was already expecting this, Emily said, her voice low and steady. I understand the situation and don't want to cause any more trouble. I'll find another place to live. George nodded, feeling a pang of relief for the pain caused, not only to his family, but also to Emily, despite his actions. I'm sorry for everything, Emily. I hope you find a fresh start somewhere. Thank you, George. I hope you all can fix things, Emily replied, before returning to focus on her bags. George left the room silently, closing the door behind him carefully. As he descended the stairs back to the reality of his fragmented life, he knew that the decision to send Emily away was just the first difficult step in many to come. The days that followed were filled with reflective silence for Charles. Each morning, as he got up, he felt the weight of what had happened, but also began to perceive the subtle threads of hope and renewal weaving through his pain. On a sunny afternoon, Charles decided it was time to face what he had been avoiding. He called his father for a walk in the same park where he had sought clarity weeks before. As they walked side by side, maintaining a comfortable distance, the initial silence was gradually replaced by a cautious conversation. Father, I've been thinking. Charles began, hesitant. About everything that happened. About us. George looked at his son, a look of gratitude mixed with sadness. I know I caused a lot of pain, Charles. And I understand if you can't forgive me now, or even ever. But I want you to know that I'm here, trying to be better. Charles nodded, the fresh breeze bringing some relief. I know, Father. And that means something to me. I'm learning that maybe forgiveness isn't about forgetting, but about understanding and trying to build something new from what remains. George stopped, looking directly at Charles. Do you think we'll ever be able to have the relationship we had? I don't know if we'll ever be like before, Father. I think some things, once broken, can't be fully fixed. But maybe we can start anew, in a different way. Charles spoke with a newly discovered maturity, a product of sleepless nights and deep reflections. I would very much like that, Charles. And I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild your trust, even if it takes years, George replied, the sincerity in his voice palpable. Let's take it one step at a time, said Charles, allowing a small smile. One step at a time. They resumed their walk, now with a more comfortable silence between them. Charles felt that, although the path ahead was uncertain and potentially filled with more pain, there was also room for growth and new beginnings. Upon returning home, Charles passed by his mother Diana's room, where she was reading. He stopped at the door, sharing a look of understanding with her. We're trying, Mother, he said simply. Diana smiled, her gaze filled with love and pride. It's all we can do, dear.